Welcome back. We're examining the situation in Sudan, where the UN is warning of rebel and government troop buildups in Darfur and how the new US policy will affect prospects for peace there. Joining us today to discuss this issue is from London, Tahir El-Faqi, Speaker of the Legislative Assembly of the Justice and Equality Movement, the strongest rebel military force in Darfur. From New York, Mahmoud Mamdani, Director of Columbia University's Institute of African Studies. And with me here in Washington is John Norris, Executive Director of the Enough Project, which works to prevent genocide and crimes against humanity worldwide. Let's get back to our discussion right now. John, let me start with you. We received an email here from Michigan from one of our viewers there, Linda Taylor, and she says as long as the Sudanese government allows the aid groups to stay in Darfur, there is some hope of getting Omar al-Bashir to do the right thing.
Well, I think the larger point, and some people are eager to portray the situation in Darfur worse than the South worse than Darfur, talking about humanitarian aid. I think it's really important to remember to look at the forest for the trees. The status quo in both Darfur and South Sudan is unacceptable, and the international community has not been sufficiently seized of either problem, honestly. In Darfur, the level of clashes has declined, but we still have close to 3 million people who can't return to their homes because of violence and insecurity, and no one has been held accountable for the atrocities that everyone in this conversation agrees has taken place. In South Sudan, we have an independence referendum looming in 2011, a spike in militia clashes this year, and I think it's really important that we not just focus on the day-to-day imperatives of delivering humanitarian assistance, as important as they are, but on the bigger ticket issues of war and peace and how we go about resolving the situation in Sudan comprehensively.
You mentioned the issue of accountability. There is an indictment out for Omar al-Bashir issued by the International Criminal Court. Do you think that is going to help the process in the end, or will it hinder the process?
I think justice ultimately is helping peace, and I think we've seen that again and again around the world. Will it make it more difficult to sort out a negotiation on day X or day Y? Maybe. But at the end of the day, we realize that until people are held accountable for orchestrating mass atrocities, other people and those same people will continue to conduct these mass atrocities. So I do think justice is an important point of leverage for the international community, an important point of leverage for peace, and sends a very important message to the people in South Sudan, in Darfur, and elsewhere who have suffered the brunt of these crimes.
Let's go to Professor Mamdani in New York. Do you share that view, Professor?
Not entirely. I think the African experience has been a little different. If you take developments since the end of apartheid in South Africa, it's been clear that in conflicts which have been ongoing and which which have dimensions of a civil war type situation, we have had a trade-off between different forms of justice. On the one hand, criminal justice, on the other hand, political justice. Political justice meaning political reform. Now, if you look at the Kempton Park talks in South Africa, what happened was that there was an agreement that there would be no justice in the courts. Nobody would be taken to courts. None of the leaders of the apartheid regime were taken to court, tried, and put in jail. The trade-off was that there would be a reform, a democratic reform. The same example was followed in Mozambique with Renamo. The same example was followed in South Sudan. And the question is, why not in Darfur? Because the kind of paradigm with which most of the human rights groups work today is a paradigm which assumes that Nuremberg is the rule, and Nuremberg was based on two assumptions. One assumption was that the conflict has ended. The second assumption was that for the victims, there'll be Israel. Victims and perpetrators will not have to live together. That's not true in Africa. Whites and blacks have to live together in South Africa. So you have to have an understanding which is not just backward-looking, punishing people for crimes committed, but also forward-looking, giving the living a second chance. And that means prioritizing political justice over criminal justice.
John, you want to respond to that?
Well, I think the examples he cites are quite selective. I think in Liberia we had a civil war in Africa where President Taylor was held accountable, is facing charges that he well deserved for his actions on the ground in Liberia. I think if we look elsewhere internationally, if we look at the former Yugoslavia, elsewhere there have been war crimes trials, people have been held accountable. And I must say from firsthand perspective, sitting down with militia leaders, guerrilla leaders around the world, they recognize that there is increasing momentum behind the forces for international justice, and it weighs on their mind, and it changes their calculation as they go about their dirty business day to day. I would certainly agree that justice can take many forms, but I think if you talk to people on the ground in Darfur, in South Sudan, elsewhere in Sudan, there is a great thirst for justice, and it's a mischaracterization to portray the quest for justice as something imposed by the North or the West or something that is external. I think the greatest advocates of justice, the greatest advocates for accountability are the people on the ground. They are Africans. They are the ones who have suffered the most.
Okay, let's go to Dr. El-Faki in London. Dr. El-Faki, General Scott Gratian, who is the Obama administration special envoy to Sudan, he says that the administration would set very strict timelines for President Omar al-Bashir of Sudan to fulfill the terms of that 2005 peace agreement that his government signed with the rebels in southern Sudan. Part of that agreement calls for elections next year, 2010, and also a referendum in 2011. Do you believe that that is realistic?
Yeah, with due respect, and I must say that I have had chances of sitting with Scott Gratian twice in Yamena back in May, and accounting to over 6 hours meeting. And my view is that he is trying to gain success in a very hasty manner. The Sudanese problem it needs to be looked at thoroughly and addressed from different dimensions. Regarding the implementation of the CPA versus the DPA or the Darfur problem, here the most important impediment to its implementation is the NCP. While the NCP is a signatory to the Nifasha agreement, it is the main impediment because it is, although it signed it, but behind the scene it seeks to undermine it. So we reiterate once again that the NCP or the National Congress Party is the main impediment to the implementation of the CPA. So for Scott Gratian, he has to work very hard, but not at the expense of the other political problems of Sudan. Sudan is a problem of marginalization. Marginalization in the south, Nuba Mountains, Southern Kordofan, Darfur, and the east. So to look at the problem as a whole in a holistic approach, by then working with the different parties, and that is acknowledged in the process that the political parties should take part in the decision making and how implementation of the NCP provisions are divided.
Okay, so just I want to get to one other issue.
For a short gain, that's
okay.
Not,
I want to get to one other issue. I want to talk to Professor Mamdani about one other issue, and that is if he could give us some idea of what he thinks about China's influence in Africa. To what extent the growing Chinese influence in Africa do you think influenced this decision by the United States to change its policy?
Well, I think the big shift in the American understanding has been that the issue should not be ideologized. That if the U.S. focuses on its interests rather than question of what to call this violence, then interests are negotiable. That's the big shift which has happened. Now, China has interests. China is knee-deep in oil in Sudan. The U.S. is knee-deep in oil in Chad. These interests are negotiable. Chinese interests in Africa are increasing because mainly because the Chinese are willing to give a better deal. Instead of building stadiums as they used to before, now they're willing to build infrastructure. And they're willing to do more than the West did in the whole of the 20th century. So the U.S. is willing to take this into account and willing to say that, okay, we'll offer counter deals. We'll make it possible for a peaceful resolution of conflicts. That's a start.
Okay, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and thank you for watching. Remember, you can follow our program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified on upcoming shows, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, one of Israel's most powerful voices of dissent, Amira Haas, the only Israeli journalist to have spent several years living in and reporting from the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Her eye-opening dispatches in the Israeli daily newspaper Haaretz have earned her the wrath of some of her fellow countrymen. Make sure to tune in for that. We'll see you the next time right here on The Riz Khan Show.
Da